sustainable development ค่ะ
ครับสำหรับผู้ที่มาถึงแล้วนะครับรบกวนจองที่นั่งเลยได้เลยนะครับเพราะว่าเดี๋ยวอีกสักครู่หนึ่งเราจะเริ่มแล้วครับ
We are going to begin the session soon, so please take a seat and we will begin shortly.
Together for ASEAN, we dare to dream, we care to share, for it's the way of ASEAN.
And academic officers from the Chula Global Network, and it's my pleasure to be an MC for this session. As for today's seminar, it is actually broadcasting live on every TV in Chulalongkorn University and also on our website as well. So our topic for today is pursuing ASEAN's economic growth and sustainable development. And we are honored to have Dr. Chayodom Sapasi, the Dean of the Faculty of Economics, Chulalongkorn University, as our moderator. Also, we have 6 discussants today. We have Dr. Neville Camel, visiting professor from the Faculty of Economics, Chulalongkorn University. Second, we have Dr. Mia Maikik, the Chief of Trade and Policy Analysis Section, Trade and Investment Division, UNSCAP. Third, we have Honor Alim Giapao, the 4th Director of the Bureau of Muslim Economic Affairs, National Commission on Muslim Filipinos, Office of the President, the Philippines. Fourth, we have Dr. Hesri Adnan, the Senior Fellow of the Innovation, Environment and Sustainability Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Also, we have Mr. Luki Lonto, Senior Energy Policy Specialist from the International Institute of Sustainable Development, Indonesia. Last but not least, we have Mr. Thanat Traitasawit, Regional Economic Studies Research Associate from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore. However, we cannot start our sessions today without the lead presenter. He is the head of the Department of Economics from the School of Humanities and Social Science, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to welcome Professor Dr. Houston Goa.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the room has a lot of echo, so I'm not going to talk too loud. Well, let me first again introduce Professor Dr. Houston Kwa, or Houston, who is an old friend of mine and old friend of member of Faculty of Economics. Professor Houston Kwa is the head of the Department of Economics, School of Humanities and Social Science, Nanyang Technological University. He's also the chairman of the Senate Committee on University Policy Matters at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Professor Houston Kwa published over 60 papers, not include books. Those papers are published in journals such as World Development, Environmental and Planning, Applied Economics, Journal of Economics, Journal of Public Economics Theory, Journal of Environmental Management, Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, American Journal of Economics and Sociology, and International Review of Law and Economics, among others. He also has booked one of the bestsellers in the world with Professor Gregory Mankiw, but Professor Houston is the co-author for the Asian edition. Well, Professor Houston Hua also presently worked as the board of Energy Market Authority in Singapore. Most importantly, Professor Hua is the editor of the Singapore Economic Review since year 2002 and the 37th president of the Economic Society of Singapore. And by the way, if you're interested in the conference, Professor Kwat is also organizing the conference in Singapore starting from the 6th to the 8th. This is one of the largest conference ever held in Asia. I heard that there will be at least 300 papers, 250 papers presenting and 300 participants at least. I don't think it's too late to register. Well, I'll give Houston 45 minutes or so, then we can have a discussion later. Please.
Thank you, Dean Chadong. I realize there's an echo here, so I hope you can hear me. I have been coming back to Chula for many years now, starting in 1988, when I participated in a law and economics workshop with the Faculty of Law and with the Canadian government's support. And we have had this every year for 5 years since 1988, and we go to different cities in Thailand. That was a very interesting experience for me, and I managed to get to know a lot of Chula friends. And ever since that, I have been back from the 1990s almost annually. So I'm happy to be back as usual, and glad to talk to you about what I think are important topics, important challenges facing the Asian environment. My message is this. One is that we cannot stop growth. We need economic growth. But growth carries a price, a cost. We need to know what those costs are so that we have to do a balance between benefits and costs. Now, many people think that growth and environment are antitheses of each other. They oppose one another, but there are many areas in which they are actually synergized with one another. And it's a failure, I think, of governments here not to capture some of these synergies between the pursuit of economic growth and the balance set with environmental concerns. And then I would send you a second message, which is that I want to look at some of the key challenges that Asia faces, and roughly what we can do about them. I can't cover, of course, all challenges. In fact, I could only identify about 4 of them, and I want to, which I think are critical, and governments here need to pay more attention to these four areas of concern. So, and then I'll finish off, if I have the time, I will digress to some issues on climate change and global warming. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, although I have many slides here, but I won't be using all of them. Okay, and along the way, I will also share with you some of the recent work that I have been doing, which sort of complement what I'm saying here. So let's start. So the first item of my talk is basically to say that we need growth. Okay. This gives you a very quick picture of the growth rates, past, present, and projection to the future for countries in ASEAN, especially the ASEAN 5, and then Thailand. So I specifically single out Thailand because I'm here, right? But you see that the ASEAN economies have yet to catch up. So, 2015 to 2019, the growth rate was 6.9%. 2016 to 2019, the growth rate was 7.9%. 2017 to 2019, the growth rate was 8.9%. 2018 to 2019, the growth rate was 9.9%. 2019 to 2020, the growth rate was 10.9%. 2020 to 2021, the growth rate was 11.9%. 2021 to 2022, the growth rate was 12.9%. 2022 to 2023, the growth rate was 13.9%. 2023 to 2024, the growth rate was 14.9%. 2024 to 2025, the growth rate was 15.9%. 2025 to 2027, the growth rate was 16.9%. 2027 to 2028, the growth rate was 17.9%. 2028 to 2029, the growth rate was 18.9%. 2028 to 2030, the growth rate was 19.9%. 2030 to 2040, the growth rate was 21.9%. 2030 to 2040, the growth rate was 22.9%. 2022 to 2025, the So this gives you a GDP per capita in 2012 from the World Bank data. Ignore the Singapore and Brunei. Singapore is a city-state and Brunei is an anomaly, right? But the rest are still very low GDP per capita. Now, we have been familiar with the term sustainable development ever since we have the Brundtland Commission in 1987, where the Prime Minister coined the term that we need the sustainable development, which is essentially development that meets the present needs, but at the same time, we don't reduce the capacity of the future generation to meet their own needs. Now, while this is a very nice definition, and it shows concern for future generation, the problem is that how do you really operationalize that concept? If you look at the literature on sustainable development, there are more than 20 definitions of even that basic definition of sustainable development. So the difficulty in operationalizing it, implementing the idea, takes paramount, I think. So in the past, there's a lot of talk, but no action on the concept of sustainable development. But more recently, I think at least we see some ideas about some of the areas in which we can implement that idea of sustainable development. Now, remember, sustainable development comprises the idea, the basic idea of meeting the needs of the present, right? So if you look at this next slide, the ASEAN's Human Development Index 2012. So have we met the needs of the present? The answer is no. The Human Development Report 2013 tells you that many of the countries in ASEAN is still well below the threshold. What about the poverty gap? The poverty gap at $1.25 US per day, purchasing power parity, is still very low. So these are some of the countries in ASEAN. So growth must continue simply to meet the needs of the present. The needs of the present generation has not been met. That's a fact. If you look at some of the reports coming out, over 70% of Asians, inclusive of ASEAN, don't even have proper sanitation, fresh water, and so on. So the needs of the present clearly have not been met. But growth carries a cost. The local cost, regional cost, global cost. Local cost, and you have witnessed in Bangkok, the air is very bad. And similarly for other cities like Jakarta. In terms of the regional impact by growth, well, we have a couple of them. One is transboundary pollution, the forest fires from Indonesia. As you saw last month, it blanketed the whole of Singapore, and it affected Malaysia very badly as well, and in some years affected southern Thailand as well. And also, the upstream damming of the river affected the downstream users. So damming of the Laotian dams affected some of the usage of the water systems downstream in the Mekong. And then globally, of course, ASEAN as well as Asia contributes to the global warming and climate change through the emissions of carbon emissions. So growth is important, but growth carries a cost, right? Here are some pictures. Now, I developed a cough, allergic cough, when I came to Bangkok yesterday or 2 days ago. And so please excuse me if I talk a bit slow. You can see all the cups are here of water, just in case. Now, this growth also impacts the future generation. So remember the sustainable development definition. meeting the needs of the present, which by simple statistics, I showed that we have not met the present needs. And then it also, the second part of the definition is that sustainable development means without affecting the capacity of the future generation to meet their own needs. So we need to have continued economic growth in order to bring about a higher standard of living and some affluence. And at the same time, because growth carries a price, and one price is it affects the environment, and this in turn affects the capacity of the future generation to meet their needs, right? So there is a need to think about ways to protect the environment. Now in economics, we learned that there is no such thing as a free lunch, and we need to face opportunity costs. You'll be surprised that many of the laymen, they don't understand this concept, simple concept of opportunity costs, okay? But we do. Now this simply means that we have to make choices because we face trade-offs. So we have a problem, we need to make a decision. The decision carries a cost. How do we make that decision? In economics, we talk about the idea of minimizing opportunity costs or maximizing net gains. And so this area of study on cost-benefit analysis is very important. And that leads to one important point, which is that many times we hear about multilateral treaties like Copenhagen Accord, Kyoto Protocol, Durban meeting. These are multilateral negotiations to bring about a treaty, an agreement. The agreement will have in such a way that countries all over the world, when they sign to this agreement, they ensure that they cut carbon emissions by a certain quantum, gradually, by a certain date, and so on. But that kind of multilateral global agreement is very hard to achieve. It's very hard to achieve simply because many countries of the world, including, of course, Asia and ASEAN, we have different priorities. The priority over here is to ensure that we meet the needs of our present generation, which we already say they have not yet been met. So obviously the priority must go to that first, rather than straight away talking about emissions cut. And because there are different stages of economic development, I feel that it's better to support these countries by encouraging them to have good environmental strategies in terms of national strategies. So I believe that if you take care of your own home, your own country, then if everybody does that, then the whole world will be better off. Rather than the other way, which is you come from the top. The top gets everybody to agree and then implements it, and everybody must follow. Because that way is not going to work. And I think in recent global environmental negotiations, especially the Annex 1 countries, they begin to understand this concept a little bit more. And they now begin to accept that this idea that everybody has a common purpose, but it's a sort of differentiated way to get to that purpose. Now, there are many things we can do to encourage good local environmental practices. And here I list 8 of them. Getting the prices right, which is the most basic. Because if the prices are wrong, then obviously we are going to make wrong decisions because we don't take into account the full cost of making a decision. Take, for example, the fuel subsidies. You remember, like, when Malaysia, Indonesia, when they try to take away the fuel subsidies, and because they take away the price of petrol went up, there was a huge protest, right? Because people want it cheap. And because it's cheap, people will consume more. So the prices get distorted. Now you learn in behavioral economics, the endowment effect. When you give people something, it's very hard for you to take it back. So you have to be very careful about when you craft public policies. The other thing about getting the prices right has to do with when you take resources from the ground, you only cover the extraction cost. You don't think about the future cost, right? The second item, which I think is important, is that many countries don't do cost-benefit analysis enough. And when they do, they are incomplete. So I'll discuss a little bit more of that later on. In fact, when I first go to Singapore, 1986, even in Singapore, from 80s to the middle of the 90s, they don't do cost-benefit analysis. They do cost-effectiveness. There's a difference between cost-effectiveness and cost-benefit analysis. In cost-effectiveness, a decision is taken to do something, and you find the cheapest way to get the thing done, without thinking through what are the benefits of doing that thing thoroughly. It's only after the mid-90s where, because of budget constraints, because of greater affluence, there is a greater demand for understanding why a certain decision is made. So cost-benefit analysis then came in. You have to consider both sides of the coin, the benefit side and the cost side, right? Number 3, externalities and non-market goods. Now this is very important as countries continue to develop. Take, for example, you are going to build more road and rail networks, fast trains, BTS. Now when you build all this, it comes with the cost, right? The cost is not just the labor and the resource materials that go into the MRT and the BTS system, but rather the cost that inflicts on traffic, the cost that inflicts on air pollution, the cost that inflicts on noise, right? And people congestion as well. All these are costs of any project. Now, if you don't take into account of these so-called non-market goods costs, then when you do the cost benefit of the BTS system, of the rail network, it's going to be incomplete. Now, you may say that society needs these transport links, BTS, for transportation purposes and to alleviate traffic congestion. That is true. But why should it come at a discount? Because clearly, other people suffer as well. So can you imagine if you live next to a train station, it's going to be very noisy and crowded. So your cost should be taken into account and factored into the project. The other thing, of course, we are known for this, right? Air pollution has a cost. So who contributes to air pollution? It's, of course, people like you and I when we drive, but there are also the firms and the factories, right? So you must try to figure out a system where you increase the cost to these parties, consumers, producers, to factor in these costs so that when they price their goods, it reflects this cost. And that's the true cost to society. I think this pricing of so-called in economics external effects are not taken into account much, but they should be and they must be. Expanding market solutions. There are many good reasons why we want the market as an instrument in which we allocate our resources. the market sends the right signals, and also in the area of the environment, the control of the environment, it is through market solutions and market instruments like taxes, emission charges, deposit refund systems, so on. They are better instruments than a government command and control instrument. Why? Because theory has shown us that the cost of controlling these environmental pollution problems would be lower if you use the market instruments than the command and control systems. So wherever possible, we want to create instruments whereby they allow themselves for people to adjust preferences, adjust behavior, and the only way is through the market instrument solution. 5, we need to be aware that countries in ASEAN and Asia, we need to set up baselines, minimum baselines. So what is our air quality now, our water quality, our noise quality, and so on. We need to establish all these environmental indicators, collect the data upon which we can do the analysis. Many countries in ASEAN don't even have proper accounting and collection of this data for analysis. If you don't have good data, how are you going to do good analysis? You just simply can't. You get distorted analysis. If you get distorted analysis, you're going to get distorted public policy decision making. So that is the most basic. And I think that if you're talking about help from the rich countries to the poorer countries, that help is crucial. It's not just giving you money, right? You must build the capacity of the local countries to collect this data, to analyze this data. So establishing baselines, doing good data analysis is extremely important. And once you can get all that, you can think about the long-term goal of not just worshipping the GDP, but also you can supplement the GDP with green accounting so that you know what is being removed from a country versus what has been added on in terms of economic growth. So you know exactly what is the trade-off. Damage schedules is something that I have been working on for the past 8 to 10 years. And I'll share with you a little bit more in later slides. But the idea is consistent with this bottom-up approach. The idea is to solicit preferences, priorities from society. What do they deem as most important? Know these priorities, establish damages if these priorities are being taken away in the pursuit of economic growth. I'll talk about that later. Green technology. Green technology, I think, is a must. That's the future. And people like to criticize China, but do you know China is the world's largest investor of green technology? That's a fact. The reason you don't observe a lot of things happening, because China is a big country, requires time to adjust. So for the policies to sink in, right? People need to adjust, firms need to adjust, government officials need to adjust. It takes time for big countries. But green technology is the way forward, and I think that with new innovations, new green technology, and more countries subscribing to it, the cost is going to come down, and therefore more of countries is going to adopt it, rather than dependence on fossil fuels. Stakeholders. Stakeholders is extremely important. Take, for example, the haze situation in Indonesia. Who are the stakeholders? The stakeholders is not just the government of Indonesia solving a problem. It's not just the plantation owners and the farmers. Do you know that in 1997, for the period of the 3 months where Southern Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore were covered in haze for 3 months, affected tourism, affected businesses, affected flights, affected leisure and recreation, affected productivity, affected health. But on top of that, the carbon emission generated from the transboundary haze for that 3 months is larger than the entire Europe's emission of carbon for that year, for the entire year in 1997. So you see, who are the stakeholders? It's not just the Indonesians. The international agencies should get into the act as well and try to resolve this problem. So if you just leave it to the Indonesia and the plantation and the farmer, it's not going to solve that problem. The victim countries, the world community ought to play its part as well and come in as stakeholders. Another example of stakeholder is that nowadays, as Asia continues to develop, we will need more nuclear power station, we will need more airport, we will need more landfill, we will need all kinds of facilities. The question is, where do you put these facilities? In the past, governments can decide and they just say, okay, I'll put this power station in rural town X. But as Asia continues to develop, the people become more educated, more affluent. People demand a participation in decision making. So that's why you see that whenever Korea or Taiwan propose to set up a nuclear power station somewhere, or in Xiamen they talk about chemical factory, they can't get it set up because the local community, people living around that oppose very strongly, come out into the streets, demonstrate, and they even put a stop to some of these projects. Mind you, these projects are also good projects because they bring income, they bring jobs to the country, right? But there is a trade-off. The threat on health as well as the external effects that they impose. So these trade-offs must be studied in greater detail, and the stakeholders, the people living around that city, their concerns ought to be taken into account fully. So working with stakeholders is very important. Okay, so I've come to a pause, the first part of my talk, which is basically aiming at ASEAN needs to grow, just as Asia, because we have not met the needs of our present generation. But growth carries a cost, and we need to be aware of these costs. And one huge cost is the environment. We need to look at how we can pursue this growth, at the same time minimize environmental damages. And I've identified the 8 areas where governments in ASEAN and Asia should pay particular attention, because if they do that, you are going to have growth, but at lesser cost to the environment. The second part. The second part of my talk deals with what are the key challenges that I see facing ASEAN countries. The NIMBY syndrome, which I just referred to just now, it stands for not in my backyard. Okay? And these are facilities that as the country grow, society need them. Like I said, landfill. You need a landfill. you need an incinerator. You need airport, right? You need facility that generates electricity. You need roads. But the question is, where do you put these facilities, right? And so everybody will say, we want them, but as long as the facility is not next to our home, right? So that's a not in my backyard syndrome. Now, you don't have to be worried about I don't know how many of you here are economists, but if you use the cost-benefit analysis the standard way, and we look at efficiency concerns, then in a not in my backyard syndrome will not exist. Because when you take the cost-benefit of the entire country, the benefits is bound to be greater than the cost that affects the local communities. So if you do a standard way of CBA, that's not going to work, right? So I've just noted it down as well. You might be familiar, there was a lot of protests in Malaysia the last 2 years on this plant, the rare earth processing plant, which the Malaysian government separately negotiated with an Australian company, and all was ready to go, but they don't know where to put it. People oppose it because the argument is that people perceive that this plant is going to damage the river systems, therefore in turn damage the water systems, therefore in turn damage health. This is Indonesia. They want to build a new nuclear power station. They have identified the site, and that's near the Mount Muria. Unfortunately, Mount Muria is actually near the fault line, so that might affect the stability and the safety of this plant. And if it does, something goes wrong, it's going to destroy the entire area, as well as going to affect not only Indonesia actually, Java, but also because of its proximity to Singapore, it's going to affect Singapore as well. So this is 3,000 villagers, protested. So they still have not got the final approval to go ahead with the plant. There are a lot more on the NIMBY syndrome, and the literature comprises of, as far as I can identify, 3 areas. There are a lot of it have been written in the political, social, and administrative papers. I've identified some of the seminal papers that you may want to see. And then there are a lot of work done on the technical aspects of the NIMBY of the facilities, the risk perception of the people, and how to get the people to agree, the probability of accidents, all has to do with technical aspects. And then finally, the economic literature, which included some of my works in 98, 99, and 2002. And this looks at how we resolve this siting of the NIMBY facility. And for those of you who are keen, it actually deals a lot with auctions. You go to an auction, you have a painting. How much will you pay for this painting? The highest bidder wins. In the case of the NIMBY, it's not a good, it's a bad, or perceived to be a bad. So if you are the government, you want to locate in a city or town which has the lowest social cost. So the trick is, how do you identify the town with the lowest social cost? 1, you can play a game and ask for the social cost, and then you just pick the town with the lowest social cost. Problem is, people or the town may play a game with you, with the central government. Number one, they want compensation. So they may give you a social cost which is higher than the true cost, right? And so there are papers which deal with this aspect of auction, reverse auction, and secondly, how do you minimize strategic bidding? So this uses a lot of the game theoretic literature. So if you are interested, you can check out all these papers. Now this one I've said a little bit earlier, that we need to price environmental goods, which are green goods. And if we price them, if every development project includes the price of reduction in air quality, water pollution, noise pollution, destruction of a beautiful landscape, destruction of a historical site, if you put all the price into your cost benefit, then you have a complete picture. Then you can think about the trade-off carefully. It's because there are many ASEAN countries, we just go ahead with development, go ahead with growth, go ahead with building a shopping mall, factory, residential housing. We forgot that the price goes beyond the cost of the labor and the resource materials. We need to price the other goods as well. The year was 1992. Now in Singapore, we have the area called Marina South. Marina South used to be just green area, a field. They have hawker centers or food courts. And later they have a famous club for young people. And people go to Marina South to play kites, model aeroplanes, and also